Mm-hmm.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CCMA's 2017 National Study of the Catholic Campus Ministry webinar. Barbara has joined us today, and she will be conducting this webinar. So I will now turn it over to her to introduce herself. Barbara McCrabb, you're on.
Great, thanks, Frank. Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted that you're able to join us. As Frank mentioned, my name is Barbara McCrabb. I am the Assistant Director for Higher Education, serving in the Secretariat for Catholic Education at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And it's been my pleasure both to really help shepherd this national study. It's really it's been many years, decades probably, since we have done a study like this. And I'm really very eager to share with you some of what we found. So let me start with just a couple of things. So the national study was done in a broad consultation by including a variety of sociologists and researchers, market research, a number of universities, campus ministers, faculty, and a number of partners. So as we look at the study, you'll see the richness of that collaboration, right? So let's see, there we go. So to give you a little bit of background, the Secretariat for Catholic Education seeks to rejuvenate the ministry through a dynamic engagement of the faithful. So we do that really in two objectives, or through two objectives. To renew a national vision of campus ministry as a community of faith, evangelization, and discipleship, and to develop guidelines for the formation and orientation, ongoing development of campus ministers. And those two objectives, in terms of the study, led us to four goals. To conduct a national study of campus ministry, to try and look at the impact that campus ministry has on individuals, and to identify necessary formation, enrichment, and development components for those who serve in campus ministry. In addition to that, we sought to engage bishops, campus ministers, campus ministry organizations and networks, stakeholders in rejuvenating campus ministry. And so let me give you an idea what I mean by that. The Alliance for Campus Ministry includes organizations like the Jesuit network of schools, the Mercy schools, Franciscan schools, Focus, and St. Paul's Outreach, Evangelical Catholic, Esteem, an initiative of the Leadership Roundtable, University of Notre Dame, and Steubenville. Were all part of the formation of this process. So if we look at our study, we designed the process to be in really four stages. So last fall, we met at Notre Dame to design the instruments we would use. The instruments were implemented. We have two studies, instruments that were put out and responded by you and students from your campus this spring, right, February to the end of March. And we're now in really the interpretation phase. A number of folks in the research group spent really much of their summer kind of looking at different dimensions of the data we found, looking for cross-tabulations, correlations, to help us really understand life in campus ministry. And then our next step will be the application, our future initiative, which is to develop new guidelines for the formation and orientation, ongoing professional development for campus ministers. So we used two instruments to carry out the study. The first instrument focused on campus ministers. Here we defined a campus minister as someone who is serving on a campus whose primary role is the pastoral care of the campus community. We identified over 1,900 active campus ministers across the country, using various networks, calling dioceses. So 1,911 active campus ministers, and we would recognize their presence on 816 campuses. So the responses we received to the survey include over 1,000 responses, which puts us at about 57% response rate. Now, the second instrument we developed was for students. A number of the questions paralleled those we asked of the campus ministers, and a few others to help us understand a little better the experience of some of our those who participate in campus ministry. Now, those surveys were sent to the campus minister with a link asking them to pass that on to their students. So the reality is the survey is not statistically sound because we don't know how many surveys we started with as campus ministers sent it to their leadership teams or to students who've been involved. So we don't know the number of student responses, of how many invitations were sent. I can tell you that we received 3,336 responses. Now, those responses indicate somebody who completed 90% or more of the study, right? If we allow for more blank questions, that number goes up a little bit more. But I think the truest read of the student information comes from that 3,300 responses. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what the study tells us in terms of the state of campus ministry. So first, let's talk about who they are, right? To look at a basic profile of who a campus minister is, we look at a personal summary. In terms of gender, we see more men, 54%, than women. Now, if we account for the ordained among us, then among simply the laity, women are 60% of the population. Our average age is 40 years old. And I thought this was interesting. 40% of campus ministers are 30 years old or younger. We are predominantly white, Caucasian at 82%, and overwhelmingly single, right? 68% single, 30% married. And then in terms of vocational status, 70% are lay, 23% priest, 8% deacon or religious. Then if we look at a little bit of the work history or work summary, I think some interesting notes here. 90% work full-time. Only 23% work 40 hours or less. Right, we're at 34% work a 40 to 50 hour week, another 27% work 50 to 90 hours. So overwhelmingly, we're seeing a lot of hours going into campus ministry. Now, 33% of campus ministers have other jobs. That could be within the diocese, it could be within their either Newman Center or parish. I thought that was significant. And then if we look at average experience, so the average is 7.1 years. Now, if we look at that number by ministry model, we'll talk about the ministry models in a minute, but if a campus minister is in an office-based or more likely a Catholic college, that average years goes up to 9.8 years. Newman Center at 7.6, parish-based slightly less at 6.8, and missionaries at 2.2, right? And in a similar way, if we look at the average year's experience by educational level, we see that the bachelor's degree has the lowest average at 2.6, those with a Master of Divinity, 8.5, a master's degree, 9.5, and a doctoral degree, they're at 12 years. So we see some interesting correlation to just who's in campus ministry. And I want to look a little bit at where they are, right? So now, again, these are our respondents. So this is out of the 1,047 respondents. 32% are office-based. Office-based tends to correspond primarily with Catholic colleges and universities, although it also relates to those at perhaps a private non-Catholic institution where they are part of the university. Missionaries make up 24% of our sample. Newman centers or a Catholic center are 20%. Parish-based ministry is 14%. Diocesan ministry at 6%. Now you'll see, if we look at the types of ministry and kind of where campus ministry happens, you'll see some interesting blocks in this slide. Right, so if we look at public four-year institutions, 80% of parish-based ministries happen at that four-year institution. 81% of Newman centers or Catholic centers happen at four-year institutions, and 76% of missionary activity happens at that four-year institution. So here you'll see Catholic colleges. That office-based ministry model makes up 85% of Catholic colleges. We see 15% of missionaries are present on a Catholic college or university. And then within the private schools, we see a variety. The highest among the Newman centers, Catholic centers at 17%, parish-based, and then missionary followed by office-based. Barbara,
excuse the interruption. Just to clarify the question, missionary refer to organizations like Focus and SPO. Correct. Is the question? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So missionary tends primarily Focus, but it would also include St. Paul's Outreach as well in those numbers. So yeah, thanks for that question. So then if we look at college size, right, we see the smaller institutions, often Catholic, that have primarily that office-based ministry. If we look at our largest institutions, we see the greatest presence through parish-based ministry and missionary activity, followed by Newman centers. So we see a good involvement, a good range. And here we get a little more demographic as we look at who the campus ministers are, right? So the average age of those working in parish-based ministry is 42, similar, the same with Catholic Newman centers, and then 46 for those based in an office. So, and again, the office we're thinking is primarily Catholic colleges and universities. And then 25-year-old for the missionaries, which makes perfect sense. So we see a heavier rating of men, certainly in parish-based than Newman Center. In some ways that accounts for those who are ordained and serving in those ministries. And we look again at married life. Married life seems most viable for office-based campus ministers, right? So hopefully that all makes sense. If there are questions, as Frank mentioned, please don't hesitate to chime in. One of the things I find in looking at this framework is that we see some interesting. There are clearly different models of ministry, and yet there's a complementarity of how those ministries serve across the variety of institutions. So next I want to talk about formation, training, and professional development. Now, if you can keep in mind, the campus minister instrument focused very heavily on questions of formation, how well equipped people feel for the ministry that they are entrusted with, training, and ongoing professional development. So if we look at formation for campus ministers, I would describe it in these couple of ways. So degree-based education is our highest response rate. 53% of campus ministers have participated in a degree-based training or formation. Supervised ministry, 45%. Missionary training at 38%. And one of the things that's, I think, particularly interesting about the missionary training is that someone who's had missionary training is more likely to only participate in that as an exclusive component to their formation, right? So they're less likely to go on for certification or postgraduate work, or even to participate in, for example, Frank J. Lewis or the Campus Ministry Leadership Institute. Another interest, and then our other category, again, had a variety of write-in responses. We would describe that as seminary or diaconate, religious life, other academic training. So generally speaking, I think campus ministers feel they are receiving effective formation, in particular for faith-related activities, right? And we see a level, so we asked campus ministers, and you see the question at the bottom of the slide. The STEM question was, my ministry formation effectively equipped me to, and then you see the variety of responses. There are options to respond where I strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly agree. So what you see here in the dark green bar are those who strongly agree that their formation effectively prepared them to, for example, understand and articulate the faith, to represent the Roman Catholic Church and the teachings to the public, to accompany people on their spiritual journey, to facilitate an encounter with Jesus, or to share a personal witness or testimony. So we see those are the strongly agree are all in the 70% or more, and even in the somewhat agree, we're running in the 90-95 percentile in terms of people feeling well equipped. We see a little more moderate responses in discipling others and providing effective pastoral care. Perhaps the area where campus ministers felt least equipped is really in their familiarity with other religious traditions. Now that shifts a little bit. Our comfort, campus ministers' comfort, shifts a little bit as we begin to look at administrative activities, right? So again, same STEM, my formation equipped me to, but we see a different set of expectations, right? Developing professional relationships, discerning the needs of the campus community, calling forth and coordinating the gifts of the community. And so those again are our highest strongly agree. As we move into the next segment of kind of somewhat effective, organizing events, administrative work, navigating diocesan and institutional structures, and seemingly everybody's least favorite, creating and managing budgets. Totally understandable. So I think it's a valuable piece to see how people feel prepared and equipped. I'm mindful in an earlier conversation we had with a group of campus ministers, it makes sense to me that, for example, there is less interest in navigating diocesan structures or creating and managing budgets. And that would certainly make sense as someone is entering the field of campus ministry. As I think about it from a more long-term perspective, I think the capacity to move into leadership roles and responsibilities within campus ministry, either within Focus or within Newman Center or even a Catholic institution, some of those other pieces are essential to move into more of a leadership role. So one of the things let me move to this next slide. I want to look at formation and effectiveness by interest, right? So we're looking at highly effective formation across the bottom axis. And on the left axis, we're looking at, we asked people about if they had an opportunity for further training and development, what would they want that training in? So we focused on the highest ratings, right? Those who strongly agree and were very interested. And it gives us a little perspective of how we might focus our response to the survey. So that upper right-hand quadrant looks at excelling, right? Where their formation is high, they feel highly effective, and they have interest to continue training. In the bottom left, we see a low priority, where both the formation is weaker and frankly, there's low interest in additional training. We describe satisfied as those who have a relatively high formation with a lower interest in training. And the last quadrant looks at unmet needs, right? Their formation was weaker and their interest in further training is high. So we're gonna move to the correlations we just looked at in light of this matrix to give us an idea about effectiveness of formation and additional training. I also want to note that our scales are a little uneven so that we could make greater distinctions in the responses we received. So that in some cases, you see a different scale. The bottom runs to 80% and the left margin runs only to 50%. Okay, so if we look at the excelling category, the things with the highest interest rate and greatest effectiveness: accompanying people on their spiritual journey, facilitating an encounter with Jesus, discipling others in Christian living, and providing effective pastoral care. So these are areas where people have a higher interest in additional training and areas where they already feel somewhat effective. We look at lower interest in training, but where people feel effective, their ability to understand and articulate the faith, representing the church and its teachings to the public, and sharing their own personal witness, their own personal testimony. Of course, as we saw in the couple slides ago, the lowest rating of both interest in training and in effectiveness is the familiarity with other religious traditions. And certainly some campuses are in environments where there's a greater collaboration among religious traditions, and where that kind of training and formation might be valuable, right? Now, if we look at, so that was the pastoral needs. These reflect the interest in terms of the administrative needs. And again, in excelling, we see discerning the needs of the campus community, again, a higher interest in training, and calling forth the gifts of the community. A little less interest, lower levels of interest in terms of areas where people feel effective, developing professional relationships, organizing public events. And then again, low effectiveness and low interest, administrative tasks, navigating diocesan structures, creating and managing budgets. So those give us a sense of, I would say, particular needs in terms of training that we might consider as we look at creating those kind of guidelines for formation. In this next section, I want to talk about job satisfaction. And I'm happy to say, first off, that by and large, campus ministers are happy with their work on campus. We see, you see at the bottom of the slide, it says, this explores the level of satisfaction with different aspects of their current ministry. We ask them if they would say they are currently very satisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied with the variables before us, right? So the highest rating is within what category we've described as kind of interpersonal aspects of ministry, and certainly the most prominent, the highest very satisfied response and overall response is relationship with students. Second would be relationship with colleagues, and then we see the level of participation of students. So less satisfaction in terms of levels of participation, but again, a positive relationship. If we look at kind of the administrative aspects of ministry, we see, again, the dark blocks represent very satisfied, somewhat satisfied. So these move to a little bit lower. We're in more of a 75, 80 percentile for still a positive response. Compensation package, reporting and accountability structures, facilities, workload, process of evaluation and program assessment, opportunities for training and ministerial formation, availability of sabbaticals. So the least responses, the least satisfied responses would be in that evaluation category and in opportunities for training. What we did in this next slide is took first the interpersonal, and we'll do a second slide with administrative, but to do a comparison among the organization types. So as you see, in terms of relationship with students, missionaries tended to rate their satisfaction highest, followed by office-based, Newman centers, and then parish-based ministries. In terms of relationships with colleagues, we see the missionaries have a considerably higher response rate in a positive framework. Now, some of that we might attribute to the fact that missionaries, certainly focused missionaries, work on a team right on campus, but typically of peers, kind of like-minded folks. Whereas if we might compare that to, say, the parish-based ministries, there's a breadth of pastor, associate pastor, directors for religious ed, adult faith formation, as well as campus ministers, and where those colleague relationships might be a little more challenging. And again, we see that drop in student participation. If we look to the well, let me make this up. So there's a trend for parish-based organizations to be slightly less satisfied on relational items. There's also a trend for the missionary organizations to be more satisfied, particularly regarding their relationships with colleagues. If we then look at the administrative responses, and we see, again, in the early items, missionaries having slightly higher levels of reporting, I find particularly the reporting and accountability structures, this opportunities for training and professional development, ministerial formation, where we see a considerable drop for office-based, Newman Center, and parish-based ministries. That's certainly a point of concern. I think as we look at developing guidelines and opportunities, that is certainly something we would want to address. And then that next category that looks at availability of sabbatical or leave, I will say that the common conversation among the group has been, so we want to know where those sabbaticals are available for campus ministers. I think a number of folks would like to apply there. But those opportunities for leave and for training Certainly, it seems that the missionaries are happy with opportunities, and those that find themselves in either office-based Newman centers or parish-based are probably looking for more opportunities along those lines. Workload, physical facilities, compensation package, budget, all seem to rate much more closely in the findings. Office and parish-based campus ministers are less satisfied on most items, and those in Newman centers, Catholic centers, are comparatively fairly well satisfied on the majority of these activities. So we tried to look at something of outcomes, and I'm mindful that this is purely a perspective. We asked both campus ministers and students how well campus ministry prepares them for, and we had a series of questions. So you see on this slide the 8 categories that we raised in terms of how well campus ministry prepares someone. And their response options were strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, sorry. So lifelong relationship with Jesus, living a moral life, to live a just life according to the teachings of the church, active participation in a parish, to give witness to Catholic faith, to be compassionate with those on the margins, to face challenges to the faith, and to discern a religious vocation. So these responses reflect the strongly agree category. We see the highest rating of people, campus ministers, feeling like campus ministry prepares students best for a lifelong relationship with Jesus. Second would be to be compassionate for those on the margins. Now, I want you to keep in mind that these are the campus minister responses. I will say the campus ministers were a little harder on themselves, recognizing that there's probably some level of personal bias as they're rating how well they prepare students through campus ministry for these various categories. But the next slide looks at student responses. So the blue columns represent the student response. And again, we still see the highest rating is that lifelong relationship with Jesus. If we take into account the student perspective, that living a moral life is second, active participation in a parish is third, living a just life, giving witness, being compassionate. I want to point out a concern, or a point of concern for me, is that last item, right, discerning a religious vocation, receives the lowest rating in both samplings, and I think that certainly is a point of concern for us. If we look at these checks and X's, so in the first 3 categories, there's agreement in a positive framework. And in the last 2 categories, we see an agreement, but in a less effective way. It's the middle 3 where we see some discrepancy between how campus ministers report and how students reported their feeling confident or prepared. Now, we did another exercise in looking at this data and in trying to compare some of the activities that students participate in, and how that correlates to what we see in terms of their confidence in feeling prepared. So, for example, using the item campus ministry prepares students for a lifelong relationship with Jesus, we see that in the orange bars, or to give witness to their Catholic faith, we see in the blue bars. And here we see this based on their, the first three lines are the kind of institution, right? Catholic institution, private non-Catholic, and a public four-year institution. And in the bottom half, we see it based on the model of ministry, right? Be it office-based, parish-based, center-based, diocesan, and missionary. Now, these activities or these responses correlate to students' participation in prayer with scripture and participation in Mass on a weekly basis, right? So those activities, prayer with scripture and participation in Mass, seem to have the highest correlation for helping equip students for a lifelong relationship with Jesus, or to give witness to their faith. And we see that perhaps most effective in four-year institutions and among missionary organizations. But if we look at similar issue, how campus ministry prepares students to be compassionate to those on the margins or to live a just life, we see a slightly different scale, right? Again, the orange is to be compassionate to those on the margins, and the blue is to live a just life. So here we see Catholic institutions rating well in terms of student confidence, and we see again in office-based levels of effectiveness in compassion for those on the margins, seconded by the diocesan ministry model. So for these outcomes, we found that participation in service, immersion trips, charity work, advocacy were all activities that had a higher correlation to student confidence for these, compassion with those on the margins and living a just life. What I believe is what emerges for me in reflecting on that is that cross-tabulation affirms for me both the distinctiveness of our ministries, of the different models of ministry, and yet the complementarity, the importance of a relationship with Jesus, kind of that vertical axis of the cross, and compassion with those on the margins, the horizontal axis of the cross. If I could shift to telling you a little bit in introducing the students, I want to tell you a little bit about the student demographics from the student instrument, right? The response for the student instrument, now keep in mind we're talking 3,330 some responses. Our responses were mostly women, 66% women, 34% men. The median age of students was 21 years old, predominantly white, Caucasian, 88%. 11% were considered themselves to be Hispanic. I thought we had a good sampling across classes, right? Freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And a few other factors that we asked, 47% of our respondents attended an elementary or middle, Catholic elementary or middle school. 36% to high school, 35% college. 95% of those responding to the survey have received the sacrament of confirmation. And in asking them some of the kind of personal struggles or designations, I'm getting ahead of myself. Self-designations, 43% considered themselves traditional Catholics, right? So I want to be very clear. While I think our student instrument gives us some very valuable insight to students that are active in campus ministry, I also want to be clear that these are, the respondents are not only students who are active in campus ministry, they're like the choir, right? They are very active. I think if you looked at combined daily mass and weekly mass attendance, we were at like 85% respondents of the respondents. So it tells us something, but it's also a very particular slice of student body that we have responses from.
Barbara, could I stop you there, please, just for a moment?
Sure.
Before we get too far, I want to get Christine's question. I believe referring to the slide. I'm going to open, Christine, I'll open up your microphone. I just want to make sure
Let me back up.
I've cleared. I think it's the slide before that one, please.
This one? Wait, this one.
Yes, I think her question is, who answered this slide? Campus ministers or students?
These reflect the campus ministers' responses.
Okay. Very good.
This was looking specifically. Now we asked both about activities of the campus ministers and the students, although we asked them in slightly different ways, right? So we asked the campus ministers, what activities do they offer, and for them to really kind of rate them in terms of the impact they believe that has on students' growth in faith. And for the students, we really looked at, frankly, frequency of participation, things that they were most active in. For the purpose of this slide and how campus ministry prepares students, we were looking really in this comparison between activities and outcomes. We were looking specifically at the campus ministers' perspectives.
Okay. Christine, does that answer your question? I think your microphone's open. Oh, well.
Yeah, but Christine is shy.
No, he texted, yes, thanks. So I guess we'll take that. Okay, thanks, Barbara.
No problem. Okay, so keeping in mind that we're talking about the choir, I still think the information we gathered regarding student struggles are very important. And we asked this, we asked about, you'll see two sections we're going to talk about. These are personal struggles. And we asked them specifically, to what extent do they personally struggle with? And we'll see another section a little later on that are more kind of social issues, kind of things they're concerned about, but that they may or not necessarily struggle with them, right? So to take a look at this, and I've tried, so these are, so the question was, to what extent do you personally struggle with? And you see the variety of responses. I would try to describe the blue responses as things that are more kind of self-oriented or faith beliefs, faith issues in red, and then kind of other more social issues, right? And students could respond that they struggle a little, a moderate amount, or a great deal. And this compilation reflects the totality, the combined responses of people, right? And so we see that the top couple of issues, how to pray, a lack of purpose, mental health. And close seconds would be questions of self-worth, does God love me, and a need for confession. Now, one of the things I found very interesting is, in particular, on the mental health issue and pornography, those are areas where students are more likely to say they struggle a great deal. And there are gender biases there as well, right? So for the pornography, we get to that that 42%. Men struggle at a 35% rate, right? And then women less so. The mental health, women are at a 26% in terms of a greatly struggle. Actually, let me move this next slide, might be more helpful. So this lifts out areas of struggle, again, personal struggle, but for those who struggle a great deal. And so here we see pornography emerges at 27% as a high rating, mental health, and then we see kind of the role of women in the church, areas where people struggle a great deal. And you know, if I can back up for a moment to the previous slide, one of the things that concerns me, right, if we're talking about the choir, right, these are students who are heavily involved, who come to daily mass, who are involved, you know, they are very likely leaders at mass or within choirs or service trips. 79% of them struggle with how to pray, of feeling a lack of purpose, of questioning their own self-worth or whether or not God loves them. That's really significant for me in terms of how we then address, if those are the folks involved and they feel that way, how do we engage even those who are not coming, who maybe even have more substantive questions along those lines? Then I want to move to the social concerns issues. And here we see, so this breaks out a little bit different. In, you see the dark green represents a great deal, those who struggle a great deal. The kind of Kelly green there is a moderate amount, and the very light green struggle a little. So the highest areas of struggle in terms of social concerns, you know, we see pro-life issues, racial tensions, care for immigrants and refugees, and solidarity with the poor. And again, those areas where we see the greatest struggle, pro-life, care for immigrants and refugees, solidarity with the poor. Let's see. And then secondary issues emerge in terms of disparity of wealth, LGBT issues, the definition of marriage, the role of women in the church. So again, while, for example, definition of marriage kind of fell to the second half, it's also one of the areas where there's where those who struggle a great deal are fairly high. It's 40%. So again, these are student responses, and it gives us, I think, a little bit of insight to looking at where students are and things they're concerned about. So if I were to try and summarize, right, the last slide I want to look at, as we, so this past October, we held a symposium where we would begin to really unpack and kind of try to delve more deeply into the information gathered in the study. And in doing that, we brought together a number of secretariats from here at the Bishops' Conference, all of the members of the research team. There were members of the Alliance. There were 5 bishops who came to spend 3 days with us. And so as I look at overall the study, the couple of highlights I take away, at least at this point in my thinking and in conversation with campus ministers and other colleagues. The first is that our demographics call for a certain urgency. And by that, you know, early on I said we had 2,000 campus ministers. And I also said that we had, you know, campus ministers on 816 campuses. The truth is that there are, and again, our sampling is primarily 4-year institutions, be they Catholic college, public, or private institutions. More than 95% of our respondents were in 4-year institutions. The reality is there are 3,200 four-year institutions in the United States. And we have a pastoral, the Catholic Church has a pastoral presence at 816. That's roughly 1 in 4. And that's to say nothing of two-year colleges, community colleges, and how we are able to engage or be present to those campuses. So the demographics calling for an urgency, we're touching 1 in 4 campuses, four-year campuses. And I heard, I was talking with a colleague at Boston College. He was telling me that perhaps 70% of Hispanic students, first-year students, Hispanic, 70% attend community colleges. So there's a great concern for how we look at just how we reach into the higher ed world in terms of our pastoral presence. The second, the types of ministry. And I said this earlier, recognizing Catholic institutions, parish-based, Newman Center-based, diocesan, missionary, those ministries are distinct. They bring particular gifts, and there is a complementarity, like we saw in the correlations between outcomes and activities, right? That having not only students in a lifelong relationship with Jesus is important, but also having students who can be compassionate with those on the margins is also important. So that image of distinct and complementary ministries. In terms of formation, recognizing that many campus ministers want further training in things that they would already say they're reasonably good at. And that there's really less interest in things that they're not particularly good at. So that formation has to look at both how to affirm and continue to grow, as well as challenge the needs of campus ministers. Another kind of formation point of balancing that likes and needs, right? I like accompanying students. I need to be able to balance a budget. I need to know something about other religious traditions in a pluralistic environment. So trying to balance those. Looking at lifelong learning, continued growth in the faith. For campus ministers, as they continue to walk with students, and for our students as well. And recognizing that, where one starts can influence where they end up, right? So that image of service and immersion trips having an impact on compassion, where prayer with scriptures has a considerable influence, a correlation to fostering that lifelong relationship with Jesus. And finally, student struggles, in particular for me around the areas of both mental health and pornography, that they require greater attention and particular preparation. How do we care for and equip campus ministers to respond to the needs of those they are dealing with on campus? So that's a lot of information that we've given you. I want to, if there are questions or comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions.
Well, thank you, Barbara. You did a great job of getting those 5,000 slides down to those numbers.
Yeah.
We do have one question waiting here now, but while I state the question, if you'd like to ask Barbara a question, please either send the question over and I'm happy to read it for you, or just let me know you have a question and I'll open up your microphone. So let's go back to Katie had a question. Does the number of campus ministers in 1911 include the number of focus missionaries?
It does indeed. Actually, focus missionaries make up, I think at the time that we gathered the data set, focus missionaries made up about 500, maybe 550 of that 1,900 campus ministers. CCMA members make up probably another 500 to 600 of that group. So part of what's interesting for me in that front is that there are probably close to 900 campus ministers, sometimes in small dioceses or solo on a campus, who are unaffiliated, right? They're not part of the CCMA network. They're not part of the Esteem network or St. Paul's Outreach. And so part of the question about trying to develop guidelines and offering resources for both formation and ongoing development is to really help reach the breadth of those who are on campus and working in the field.
Right, we have a couple of questions that are somewhat related. Edward asks, will the results of the study be published in some way? And then I'll ask you also Austin's question. Is it possible to request more detailed feedback from our local campus responses so we can compare that to the national average? For example, does our campus see higher levels of mental health to the national average?
Right. So the first answer is yes. There will be a formal report. We're in the midst, the symposium we had kind of contributed to some of the formulation of our general findings. So we're in the midst of finalizing those reports. We'll do a preliminary report to the Committee on Education this November, and we'll begin the discussion of how to disseminate the final report. So yes, there'll be a report. So I believe it will be possible, probably not to the specific campus, because we assured privacy for folks as they respond. We should be able to do kind of a regional compilation, so maybe by state or within a couple of states, to be able to help campuses for that. And I would just say, if you have particular questions, just email me directly, and we'll figure out how to work that out.
Lisa's asking, will the slides from today's presentation be available to be downloaded?
They will, but once the report has happened to the Committee on Education, as that they're the primary audience for our data, and so I need their approval before we can begin disseminating the information. So yes, but let me see, I'm looking at my calendar. The committee meeting happens November 12th. So in just a few days, and then we should be able to make these slides available.
Do we have well, popping up so fast here I can't read them. Do we have a gender breakdown of lay campus ministers?
We do. Probably not off the top of my head. I know that the laity question, so laity is at like 68%. And if I recall, women are like 60% of laity.
Okay. And Christine has two questions related. Is there an assumption that all the students who answered were Catholic, and did they self-identify as Catholic?
There's not an assumption they were Catholic. The campus ministers were asked to share that with students who, have participated in some way in campus ministry. So not necessarily Catholic. And yes, there was a marker question for identifying as Catholic.
Great. Okay. Let's see. We'll just take another moment. Are there any other questions? Anybody would like to speak directly? Just send me a text, and I can open up your microphone. Okay, I believe, let's see. Well, I believe that might be it. I'm not getting any more questions. I guess you did a great job of condensing and presenting that material. We really thank you, Barbara, for your time and efforts on this and for being part of our webinar today.
Well, I was delighted to be part of that. I want to say thank you to all the campus ministers who participated in the study because it really contributed to the wealth of data that we were able to gather. So thanks very much.
Okay, very good. I do have some announcements from CCMA. What would it be? What would be a Catholic program if it didn't have announcements? So just a few things. CCMA's The Leading Edge webinar series December webinar title, Performance Reviews for Your Staff from Boring to Brilliant, presented by Jamie Capetta, will be held on Wednesday, December 6th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific. Don't miss this webinar to learn how to make performance reviews as an art and to get the most from your staff. And you can register online at ccmanetwork.org/webinars. The winter schedule will be coming out soon. Keep an eye on your inbox for more information. And if you haven't downloaded the CCMA app for your smartphone yet, it's available either in iOS or Android, and it's a convenient way to keep up on all things CCMA. And the CCMA mastermind groups for the winter begin in early December. These once-a-week online groups are an excellent way to stay connected to other campus ministers. We all know that campus ministry is hard, and it doesn't mean you have to go it alone. So sign up today before the spots fill up at ccmanet.org/mastermind. And finally, CCMA is coming to the University of Notre Dame on November 28th for a full day of training featuring Katie Diller from Michigan State and Father Mark Martin from Duke. This one-day event is a perfect way to learn more from two of the top campus ministers in the country. And you can reserve your spot today at ccmanet.org/one-day-Indiana. That's clever, Krista. Very good. All right. Well, we thank all of you for joining us and look forward to having you join our next webinar in December. So have a great day. And this webinar will be available as a recording from CCMA very shortly. Thanks again for your participation. And thank you, Barbara. Take care.